Just a few questions that I have myself in relation to the evidence that we've heard here this morning. I think our island communities are in a very unique position because of the Clean Energy for EU Islands initiative, and it does give them special status in terms of progressing this transition to a zero-emission, sustainable economy, not just in terms of the delivery of electricity and energy, but an overall economy. And I outlined that at the start of the meeting. And I think we need to capitalise on the islands being part of this particular initiative now, and we need to facilitate them. And Mr. O'Wenley, I think, put it very well this morning in terms of the 3 megawatt capacity that's there on that cable, the limits in relation to the export capacity, that they will be maxed out once this turbine is constructed, which effectively prohibits the local community from engaging in micro-generation in terms of accessing the export tariff because we do not have the grid capacity there. Now, the difficulty is at the moment in terms of the way the policy is structured across the department and across various government departments, and the way the regulatory mechanism is structured across government. It would be easier to push water uphill than actually get the proposal that Deputy O'Keefe has put forward here this morning actually implemented. So it does require new leadership from the department to actually drive this forward. And there's direct responsibility and competency in terms of electricity infrastructure and broadband infrastructure within your own department. And I know that water comes under the Department of Housing, but as you know, the Minister, your own line Minister, has a role in terms of the signing off on all capital expenditure by Irish Water. So the department have more than a cursory role in relation to the investment by Irish Water, and I think there needs to be ownership taken of this particular issue if we're going to deal with the specific bottlenecks that have been highlighted here this morning. And it does mean that the department needs to come up to the mark in relation to that. Now, Mr. Newsom, this morning you were making the point that, you know, the focus of the department is in terms of green energy. And look, I think we all agree that that should be where the focus is. But at the moment, we're spilling between 10 and 12% of all the renewable electricity we produce today is being spilled, is being unused because there isn't demand for it. So I think we should be prioritising the issue of green hydrogen, even to deal with the problems that we have at the moment, which will become multiples of that as we go forward in terms of meeting our 80% renewable target by 2030. And we cannot achieve that target unless we deal with the amount of electricity, renewable electricity, that is unused today. And we've seen a very practical example outlined here in evidence this morning from the island communities that they're already reaching that maximum threshold already. So any new solar panel that is put onto the 3 Aran Islands that is not used domestically is going to be actually spilled. So if we can solve the problem on the islands and use our islands as a pilot in terms of the bigger challenges that we have on the island as a whole, and it is a micro example of the challenge we have, because Ireland is an isolated electricity grid. We have unique challenges here in Ireland. So if we can solve these problems on our island communities, then we can replicate those at a larger scale on the island as a whole. But there needs to be a leadership role taken in relation to this. And I think the first place we need to start is that the Minister, who has the authority, needs to direct EirGrid to actually provide the capacity in terms of the electricity network to facilitate export onto our island communities. And unless that direction is issued by the Minister, it will not happen. That is the reality in relation to it. So unless the Minister is prepared to issue that direction to EirGrid, then in 10 years' time we'll be still having the same conversation here. We'll still be impeding the potential progress that is there on our islands. And we need to give that special, unique treatment to the islands. As part of the initiative that they are at EU level, it provides us with the opportunity to pilot some of these initiatives. Now, you spoke this morning in your evidence about the work that's going on with the SEAI as a trusted intermediary and looking at the microgeneration. Now, the reality is that these policies are currently being developed in theory and hopefully then applied in practice subsequent to that. And that's the way the SEAI are working in relation to it. But as we know, there will be unique challenges that will arise as these policies are implemented. And where better to actually apply these in practice than on our island communities? And the difficulty is that what is being designed at the moment is being designed for the island of Ireland, not our offshore islands. And I think Mr. O'Malley this morning put it very well in terms of the unique challenges that are there. The difficulty is whether we're talking about retrofitting grants, whether we're talking about microgeneration, whether we're talking about community scale generation, there are unique barriers to that happening on our island communities. And unless we are prepared to proactively address those, then none of what we're talking about here this morning will actually happen on our island communities. So I think, I think the island communities here this morning have put the challenges very well in their submission. What we now need to see is the department taking a responsibility in relation to using our island communities as individual pilots to crack the challenges, the unique challenges that we have here in Ireland in terms of sustainable green renewable electricity, use the islands as the pilot that can then be replicated on the mainland. And we need to see, right from the Minister down, right across our semi-state bodies, a proactive approach to facilitating this happening. Thank you. So if you want to comment on that.
Thank you, Chair, for those comments. Just a few points in response. You've highlighted the level of renewable electricity that's being spilled, as you put it, or curtailed, and I think that's something we're acutely aware of, and I think it does highlight the need to particularly look at other technologies to make use of that, whether that's storage, and we've talked today about green hydrogen, but also batteries, other forms of storage to try and address that. There's demand, moving demand to try and match the supply, and I think you've made the point that that islands and island communities can be essentially test beds for these type of technologies, and I know the Clean Energy EU Islands Initiative. There's many islands across Europe, Spanish islands, the Portuguese islands like the Azores, who are looking at becoming test beds for developing these sort of technologies, renewables and storage. And I think that your points are well made around how that could be brought forward here. I think the points on whether it's the export cable or actually looking at own demand and maybe storage are actually really important things to consider in the island context. I think again we are looking at storage policy, the consultation on that this year. I know John is leading on that, and I think that's one of the things. Can battery?
Mr. Newsom, if you just pause for a second to address this audio problem, because I know it's interfering. We okay again? Can we mute everyone there, please? Sorry about this, Mr. Newsom, now, but I know that it'll cause problems further. Now we can fire ahead again. Sorry.
No, so I think, I agree with those points. In terms of the role of the SEI, the trusted intermediaries, the broader community engagement and community framework that we have that underpins our RES scheme, that, as I said, the supports on that are being rolled out actually very shortly over the coming weeks, and we expect that that will provide a strong foundation. We have a target of 500 megawatts of community energy projects by 2030. So we're very serious about delivering on that, and we would like to see the island communities to avail of that, of those supports. As I mentioned, there are significant resources that SEI are making available, even through toolkits on their websites, to help communities through what can be a very difficult and challenging process. There's grant funding, there's trusted intermediaries, trusted advisors, and I think it would be really good to see the island communities engage in that. I'm sure you have already, but as they become, as those supports roll up, hopefully they can provide a way forward. I don't know if there's anything, Rory, on microgeneration you wanted to add.
Thank you. Just to say, I suppose that microgen is moving forward. In February of this year, the Clean Export Guarantee Tariff became available upon transposition of Article 21 of the Renewable Energy Directive into Irish law. So there's now an obligation on suppliers to remunerate micro and small-scale generators for any residual renewable electricity they export to the grid, and the arrangements to be put in place are underway through the CRU and the regulatory framework that's required, and we expect payments to begin after June of this year. So people who have eligible micro and small scale generators who have registered for an export connection with the ESB networks on the local grid are already accruing the benefit of that export to date, and they will receive payment later in the year. So that's the first stage of the enabling framework, and that brings a real remuneration into the marketplace that was never there before. And we also understand that it has bred a little bit of frustration with people who have been early adopters, and we know there are those in the islands as well, where they have been producing electricity for their own self-consumption, and by the nature of the profile of the demand, they've been exporting to the grid and not receiving remuneration. So this remuneration is now available, and it will begin to not only pay those people who have already invested, but it will improve the business case for those who are considering investment in the future. So that's the first phase. The second phase around microgeneration supports directly, because the Clean Export Guarantee is not a government support. It's an obligation under an EU directive, and it's funded by the suppliers. So there's no requirement for exchequer or PSO funding or any supports directly. Government is supporting microgeneration. So the first phase of the microgeneration supports is the domestic grant scheme, which commenced on the 16th of February this year. And there are changes to those supports which were started by the Chair back in 2018, a scheme that has grown from 78 applications in 2018 in its initiation to over 4,000 last year. So it's growing substantially year on year. The grant rate levels have been kept the same since the previous years in order to encourage uptake, but we've also reduced the barriers to entry to that scheme. So previously, a minimum building energy rating requirement was set at a C level, and that has been removed in order to provide greater access to houses with more challenges around energy efficiency to access solar PV in particular. And also houses built up to 2020 are now eligible for the scheme. So that creates a greater pool of potential applicants into the scheme. Later this year, the SEAI will expand that scheme to non-domestic applicants, so small businesses, farms and community buildings up to 6 kilowatts in terms of solar capacity can apply for a grant, and we expect that to be commencing in July of this year. And then the last piece of the supports is a clean export premium tariff, and this is a tariff to guarantee a fixed tariff over 15 years for electricity exported to the grid, and any difference between the market value of that electricity that is exported and the tariff rate will be funded by the PSO. Now, currently electricity prices are very high, so the impact on the PSO in the current period is likely to be limited, if not nothing at all. We expect, following a consultation from CRU, the energy regulator, in Q3 of this year on an implementation plan, that tariff will be in place thereafter. And just to say, and I know my colleague Philip Newsom mentioned it earlier, we recognise that there is a need to fill in support in the space between microgeneration and large-scale renewables under the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme, and particularly recognise the difficulties that there are with community projects in the community category within RES, which is not only a competitive category, but it also has a minimum threshold of 500 kilowatts. So not only do you have to go in to compete with other community projects, but you also have to start with a relatively large scheme. So in recognising that, the programme for government is committed to a small-scale generation scheme, and that will be looking to provide supports between 50 and 500 or maybe 1,000 kilowatts, which would not require a competitive auction environment. So that allows people to start in smaller local community projects, to build out their expertise, to recognise the challenges around the funding that's required, particularly in small communities, and also to provide a different mechanism of remuneration, so a guaranteed tariff at a fixed rate to underpin the investment. And just finally, the last piece is that in parallel with that, the exemptions around planning have been mentioned. And obviously, our department has been working with the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage on the revisions to the exemptions for solar installations, including solar PV. And those exemptions are well drafted at this stage, and they include the provision of exemptions to new building types, including community buildings, educational buildings and apartment buildings, which were not there before. So those exemptions are not available to date. They will be available once these regulations are passed. There have been challenges around the environmental assessment associated with the revisions of these exemptions, but the strategic environmental assessment and the appropriate screening, which are the two critical environmental assessments that need to be done, that work is well underway at the moment, we understand. And barring any issues coming out of those screening, we're expecting that draft regulations will be published for a 4-week consultation in the coming weeks. It would then need to go through both houses of the Oireachtas on its way to becoming law.
Thank you. Just on that, and I know Ms. Nikirat, he wants to come in there, but Mr. Summers, on those regulations, I can tell you that the shortest element of that is going to be the passage through the House of the Oireachtas. And just, can you give us some sort of a firm detail in relation to the timelines involved here? Because, you know, a few weeks is something that I heard quite frequently in relation to the wind energy guidelines that were signed off by the Minister for Housing and Local Government, Minister Coveney, and myself in May 2017. The 5th anniversary of the sign-off on those regs will come, of the draft regs will come in 6 weeks' time. They still have not been presented to the Oireachtas here, and we have absolutely no indication as to when they're actually going to be presented to the Oireachtas. So, you know, how definitive are you that we will see some progress on this in the coming weeks and months? Because I think this is a critical issue. We know for a fact that this is not a priority within the Department of Housing and Local Government. Their priorities in relation to building houses. So it is way down the pecking order from their priority listing. As a result of that, it doesn't get the type of focus that it's needed. So, you know, where practically are these at? And maybe if you could elaborate on the point that Deputy O'Keefe raised, that there are aviation issues that are arising, and could you maybe clarify what those issues are as they have been relayed by the department to yourself?
Certainly, Chair. I suppose just to start by saying that we're not responsible, as you'd be aware, for the publication of the draft regulations. Our role has been to input into the development of those draft regulations and the revisions to those exemptions to align with the policy intentions of renewable energy generation, and we've certainly tried to ensure that those exemptions will improve people's access to putting effectively solar PV on the roofs, but also on ground-mounted systems without the requirements for planning. We're receiving the updates from the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage directly, so I cannot comment on any certainty around timelines. We certainly recognise that it has taken longer than was anticipated. There have been some challenges. I know that there have been additional requirements around appropriate assessments that have come into force because of EU directives. That has increased the workload of that department. But I can say that it is a focus for our Minister, and we understand that it is a focus for members of this committee. In relation to the details themselves of the exemptions, the intention is to provide, there are minimum requirements within the exemptions, maximum thresholds for exemptions, and the intention is to review those and to improve on those, and also to provide exemptions into new building types. So we expect that it will facilitate greater deployment of solar PV in the future. In terms of the timelines and the aviation piece, there is a particular concern raised by the Aviation Authority regulator around the impact of glint and glare around airports, and particularly around the flight paths of aircraft coming into airports and aerodromes. And this includes helicopter pads around hospitals as well. We understand that the intention is to issue interim regulations that don't fully account for the impact on the vicinity of aerodromes in the first instance, in order to expedite the process. So mapping or boundaries will be set around recognised aerodromes that allow the process to be expedited faster.
Thank you. Ms. Nisgarty, you wanted to come in there.
Hello, yes, so I wanted to make some points or add some additional detail maybe to some points that have been made previously. Yesterday I attended a focus group for the Irish Islands, which was run by the Clean Energy for EU Islands initiative, and that was focusing on identifying the regulatory barriers. So as you can imagine, a lot of what we're discussing here today was also brought up yesterday. The department was represented along with the SEAI, ESB, EirGrid, and the islands were represented as well at the meeting. One of the things that was brought up was the lack of progress, I suppose, on the interdepartmental committee for the islands, which I think was established in 2019. It was certainly under consultation in 2019, and perhaps because of the recent pandemic, didn't progress any further than that. I think it's clear today that there is a dire need for an interdepartmental committee for the islands, not just for energy, but obviously for all sorts of other island needs and departmental areas as well. I think a core area of that consultation was around stakeholder engagement and engaging with island communities directly, because some committees, some departments, while they may have all of the best intentions, they can inadvertently overlook island communities, and so it's no good for departments to be overlooking island communities interdepartmentally. There's a real need for stakeholder consultation and to discuss it with island groups and to see what does and does not work, because I suppose we're obviously most aware of the challenges that we face. Aside from that, then, I suppose on the subject of green hydrogen production and utilisation, we are actually involved currently in 2 European-funded research projects on green hydrogen, both of which actually come to an end this year. One of those is looking specifically at a case study for the ferry companies, and we're looking at Galway Port. There's also a project underway in Galway Port to develop a green hydrogen hub. They, as far as I'm aware, estimate that they could produce up to 1,800 tonnes of green hydrogen per annum. And so this would be a huge boost, and this is all looking at using curtailed electricity from the nearby wind farms in Galway County. Outside of that, then again, the European Union has, I suppose, highlighted islands through their Clean Energy for EU Islands initiative. which we're all familiar with. Other countries around Europe have made funding available specifically for their island groups, which isn't available for other communities. And they've done this in order to, I suppose, support and enhance the abilities of island communities to achieve their goals around the energy transition. And I believe that the Irish government can make similar funds available to island communities to address the challenges that are specific to us. I know that there are maybe issues around financing and regulatory issues there, but if other countries have been able to make funds available specifically for islands, then I don't see a reason why our own government could do the same around the energy transition. I submitted a consultation. I submitted a response to a consultation by ESB Networks last year at the end of December. And that consultation was under their piloting roadmap as part of the National Network Local Connections consultation. In that submission, I outlined our existing assets on the island. So at the moment, we have about 300 kilowatts of air-to-water heat pumps, 150 kilowatts of PV, 185 kilowatt hours of battery storage. And as Dara outlined earlier, we have about 20 electric vehicles on the islands as well. All of these assets would allow us to, for want of a better phrase, maybe flatten the curve of our energy demand and generation. So in order to balance the grid, there needs to be added flexibility, which I'm sure you're all aware of. And these assets in such a small island grid would be the perfect opportunity to test the different technologies required, and then it could, as the chair has outlined earlier, could be scaled up and replicated across the country. This was also reiterated at a workshop which we organised in 2018 by the SEAI, but so far we haven't seen any further development on that. And I believe that the government, if they wished, would be able to provide additional supports and a real focus on our islands in order to get us over the line. There's a lot of great sentiment going around, but unfortunately we're finding that a lot of the rollout of those supports are very slow. And one example of those is the SEAI Community Enabling Framework. So you are right in saying that we have engaged with that programme and we have found it to be very, very beneficial, but it just doesn't go far enough for projects or communities which are at the stage that we are at the moment. So we were issued our grid assessment in February of this year, which means we now have 2 years to get planning permission for our project, our community turbine on Inishmaan. This, if we don't have the planning permission by that time, the grid capacity is released again, and it may well be gone by the time we come back around with our planning permission. The big thing holding us back at the moment, firstly, I don't believe that 2 years is a realistic time frame for any wind project in the country to get planning permission. Certainly not one that is being community led, purely because we don't have the expertise and we don't have the deep pockets that developers have. So things move at a much slower pace, and there is very little that can be done to help that. I think possibly for solar projects, the 2 years is feasible, but really the 2 year limit on that, in my opinion, is setting communities up to fail, because I don't see how it's going to be achievable. Certainly not on islands. For example, we could very well need to do a 2 year bird study, which straight away means that we couldn't possibly have planning permission within a 2 year period. SEAI, I believe, are in the process of rolling out and approving their financial supports for communities in order to finance the pre-development costs of generation projects. This is what we're needing at the moment. Our project and other projects who were successful in ECP 2.1 are now looking for funding for feasibility studies, for bird studies, for route surveys, and all the rest that goes into your planning application. But that financing simply isn't there. We're being weighed down by making leader applications and some very, very slow and onerous applications and waiting for decisions, all the while the clock is ticking on that 2 year period. And SEAI's supports, while I appreciate that they're coming, and I believe that they should be covering up to 80%, I hear of the pre-development costs. They're simply not there in time, and it means that communities that have gone without the support up until now are likely not to have it in time to meet their goals. And I'm wondering if there's any deadline, or if there's any indication of exactly when those supports will be rolled out in order to fund the pre-development costs of these projects. Thanks.
Senator Paddy Burke.
Thanks, Chairman, and apologies if there was an interruption on my behalf there earlier. Just a few brief questions for Rory. And it's in relation to the micro generation.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me, Chairman?
Yes, we can. Far ahead, yep.
Yeah, in relation to micro generation, we've seen recently where the ESB have put huge increases in the charges for electricity, and yet and all the tariff is only 10p. Who sets the tariff and how is it set? And is there any chance that the tariff could be increased? Because I think, in view of the costs that electricity or the suppliers are charging, I think that the tariff should be increased. There's also in some concern in relation to people who are putting in solar panels and a battery pack. There are some people are told if they have a smart meter they don't need the battery. They don't need the battery. Others are saying you need the battery to be able to manage things better. But there's a bit of ambiguity in relation to that. Also, could you just clarify again in relation to where you make the application for the exporting of electricity? Is it through the SEAI, or is there a separate application? Do you have to do it yourself, or does the people that put in the solar panels make it on your behalf? And finally, in relation to the deep retrofit, the deep retrofit doesn't suit everybody, in my view. It's very few that have the funding maybe to be able to put in place and to be able to go to the level that the deep retrofit requires. And I believe that some people, everybody knows their own house better than anybody else, whether it's the person that comes out doing the BE or not. They know their house better than anybody. They know where the drafts are. They know where all of those things are. And I think that there should be an option to do a piecemeal, whether you do the solar panels, the roof insulation, the wall insulation or whatever on a piecemeal basis, and that the grants should be done accordingly to the same level that you'd get if you were in a deep retrofit, so that over a number of years people could reach the same standards that they would have if they had a deep retrofit, but they'd be able to manage their own finances and their own resources over that period of time. So thanks, Chairman.
Thank you. So, Mr. Summers, you might come back on the questions from Senator Burke, and if the other witnesses maybe want to come back on Ms. Nicati's questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So, specifically, the Clean Export Guarantee tariff is set by suppliers individually. So, CRU, the energy regulator, has decided that the suppliers should set the tariffs on a competitive basis in order that they will compete for that business from micro and small scale generators. And the way that they set their tariff should be related to the market value of that electricity. That is the language that is included in the directive and which was transposed into Irish law. What that really means is that it is reflective of the wholesale value of the electricity. So those tariffs are set by your supplier. We know that there is at least one supplier who has advertised a tariff on their website. That tariff is in excess of 10 cents per kilowatt hour. There is talk of another supplier going even higher, and we've yet to see some of the largest players come into the market with their tariffs. Now, those tariff levels and those quantities that I'm referring to are particular to the wholesale market at the moment, which, as we know, energy prices are very high. So just in order to set people's expectations, they may not always be that high. But I think it's also important to say that your reference to what people are paying for electricity. So you will have heard it said before that solar PV in the first instance should be installed as part of self-consumption. And if you're self-consuming your generated renewable solar electricity, then the saving that you make in consuming that electricity that you've generated is offsetting electricity that you pay for from your energy supplier. And that value of that electricity is a lot higher than the Clean Export Guarantee tariff of any electricity that you export to the grid. And so what that means, it is clearly of optimum benefit to people with renewable generation to self-consume the maximum possible electricity that they generate and only export the smallest residual, because it will always be of less value if you're exporting it to the grid. In terms of solar plus batteries, I think maybe what you're referring to, Senator, is that previously in the pilot microgeneration support scheme, the domestic solar PV scheme, there was a requirement to meet a minimum building energy rating, a C rating, and that meant that people had to choose between doing energy efficiency measures in order to meet that at the time that they were planning to do solar PV. So in terms of the ability to do a single measure versus doing multiple measures, that has been addressed in the new microgeneration support scheme. So the requirement to have a minimum BER rating has been removed for domestic applicants. So you can do solar PV entirely as a single measure, and that means you're free to come back and do energy efficiency measures at a later date. However, I would say that the most benefit and the quickest payback for any investment in relation to retrofit in the home will always be in energy efficiency, because you know, the energy that you don't use is the most valuable energy, and energy efficiency, so you know, reducing your energy consumption is of more benefit to you than producing solar PV, solar electricity. On another point in relation to batteries, whether there's a need to install batteries or not, there is no absolute need to install batteries, but they can help you to manage the production, you know, the profile between the production of electricity during daylight hours and your consumption of that electricity at parts in the daytime and early evening when there's no generation happening. And that can increase your self-consumption. And I mentioned earlier that, you know, increasing self-consumption is the best way to pay back the investment. But battery costs are high, and in the work that we did in assessing the eligibility, the costs and the requirements of the microgeneration support scheme, and in particular in the grants, we recognise that battery costs are still very high relative to solar investment. And so we don't have a requirement to install a battery in order to avail of the grant support. Previously, if you were looking for grant support above 2 kilowatts, you had to install a battery to avail of the additional grant monies that were available up to 4 kilowatts. That has been removed. But in parallel with that, the battery support itself, the direct battery support, has been removed. So it means that the overall investment can be lower for people. And I suppose it's been done at a time when, in parallel with that decision, the Clean Export Guarantee tariff is there. So people can use that residual electricity and be remunerated by their supplier for exporting it to the grid. And we believe that we will keep that relationship between grant values and the requirements around battery supports under review on an ongoing basis, because in the same vein that solar panel costs have come down substantially, up to 70 or 80% over the last 10 years, battery costs are on the same trajectory, but it's just too early yet to mandate batteries. I think the last thing I would say about batteries is, of course, at a time when the decisions and the development of the microgeneration policy were taken, we didn't have the energy crisis that we're in today, where energy security has come to the fore. And I think that's one of the key features that we will keep under review in terms of the role of batteries to improve energy security overall. In terms of application for an export connection, typically domestic and small users will connect to the distribution grid, and as a result of which their applications would go to ESB networks. A solar installer will commonly make that application on behalf of the grant applicant. So approved, registered installers with the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland are very familiar with the process and understand the requirement to register for export. But it can be made by the householder themselves. There is a lot of information available on ESB Network's websites, and it's also available on our department website in relation to microgeneration.
Thank you. Mr. Newsom, do you want to come in there?
Thank you, Chair. I might just briefly respond to Ms. Carty's question on the community enabling framework for RES. So just to, I suppose, just to set out for committee members, the community enabling framework is there's a number of elements to it which need to be thought of, I suppose, as a whole. There's the toolkits that I mentioned earlier, there's the trusted advisory service, and then there's the enabling grants, and all of those should work together to support community projects through the various project phases, from feasibility, early stage, mid stage, and then actually the operational stage of the project and the meeting of the various milestones. In terms of the timing and that, I would like to have said that we had the enabling framework, trusted advisory framework done by Q1 and beat our climate action deadline, but I'm very confident that will be coming very shortly in Q2. So I can't give you a precise date, but it's coming very, very shortly, and the SEI will be announcing that. It's pretty much ready to go. I would say there's other just kind of, once that is rolled out, I think that should provide a really strong support to community projects getting through the various stages. There are other aspects of it, I suppose. Even we have the SEI will be developing an online training program for renewable energy projects, community projects. That's due by the end of the year. So that's, I think, hopefully will provide another support and training tool. We've established a RES community steering board for the Department 2 and SEI to engage with the community sector to understand what their concerns are, whether it be grid connections, whether it be elements of the planning system, whether it be indeed the grants and how the various trusted advisors, trusted intermediaries. So it could be a useful avenue for the island communities to engage actually through that. So happy to follow up on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Finnegan.
Just Deputy Carty made a couple of other general points. You asked a specific question about had an interdepartmental committee for the islands been set up. Unfortunately, I'm sorry to say you don't have the right people in the room, but we will check with that. It's similarly with the question on the department's engagement with the 10-year strategy for the islands. I suppose that's your point is well made, that there's a need to take into account the specific issues faced by islands in all decision making and all policy making. Again, just thank you for the insights into the work that's already been done on green hydrogen. As we're looking at developing this policy, it's good to know that there's somebody already actually looking in practical terms about how you might use hydrogen to fuel a ferry or use it to take spill-off electricity from a wind farm. I mean, I think I just look forward to engaging again with these projects that are already happening. And you make the general point, and it's the point that the Chairman has made as well, that the islands have a vision to be a testbed for an energy transition. And that's the challenge to us that we'll take away and look at what extra needs to be done or can be done for them to take on that role as a testbed. And again, noted that, and this was discussed yesterday, that now that you have your grid offer from February, that you have 2 years, I do understand from colleagues and from EirGrid that after the 2 years the offer will lapse, but that it can be revived, and that they will look at the study again without any additional cost, if that is of any help in the situation.
The issue, I suppose, that is appreciated, the issue with that is that the capacity may well be gone by the time they revisit it. Although it is appreciated that will be free of charge, the concern is that the capacity will no longer be there, because obviously it's open then to other projects in the meantime.
Thank you, Ms. Carty. You've had the last word on this morning. Just to say, I think, look, the clear view of the committee here is that rather than the islands being an afterthought in terms of policy development, that they're actually to the forefront and become, as Mr. Wendy said earlier on, actually lighthouse projects. That was the whole core behind signing up our offshore islands to the island strategy that was being driven at EU level. I know it wasn't exactly flavour of the month within the department at the time, but I think you can clearly see from the evidence that's been given here this morning the tremendous work that has been done, and there is an opportunity, I think, to build on that work, to develop robust models on our islands that can then be replicated right across this country to benefit not just Ireland as an individual electricity island, and those learnings to be shared with other islands like Portugal, Spain, and the smaller islands like Cyprus and Malta, but also in actually exporting clean green electricity onto the European mainland, helping to reduce our overall dependency on imported energy from outside the European Union. So can I thank all of the witnesses for their evidence here this morning, which was very constructive and very positive, and we look forward to further engagement with you as we complete our process here in relation to a report on our island communities. The Joint Committee will now proceed in private session and remain so until it's adjourned. Thank you.